Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to pick up today with some new content here in Chapter 19. We're opening the macroeconomics section of the course. A couple of thoughts here. We are shifting gears in a big way to start looking at a big picture perspective, a macro perspective on the economy, as opposed to zooming in on individual behavior. That means something about how we're going to approach questions. Generally, macroeconomics is very much data first. We'll look at observable things in the economy, like how much people are producing, what they're getting paid, or what the unemployment rate is. And then we'll try to understand those things by developing a model to explain those outcomes. Very often in micro, it seems the other way around. We introduce a significant amount of models, and then later we say things like, and that's why this or this seems to be happening in labor markets or in output markets of one kind or another. So you'll notice even starting today that I will go to a website and look at some data or look at a graph to try to understand what's going on in the larger economy. All right, so here we begin moving through our material in Chapter 19, the macroeconomic perspective. This image comes from your text and shows a number of people lined up waiting for some kind of government relief check. We're going to have to talk quite a bit about policy in response to severe moments like the Great Depression we see here and the Great Recession that occurred in 2008-2009. Before we can do a lot of that, we've got to try to get a handle on our focus in this class or in this part of the course on the tools we'll use to talk about these questions about how is the economy performing. That's really the focus of macroeconomics in general. So here I've produced for you the textbook definition. Macroeconomics focuses on the economy as a whole. Okay, that's a kind of broad definition. We're going to answer questions like, what are the causes of recessions, and then the opposite, expansions? What makes unemployment a part of a recession? And then we have this kind of interesting trend where it tends to lag after recessions are over. We'll talk about things like growth and standard of living, a lot of big picture questions, especially contrasted to the micro section of the course where we were very much focused on individual choice and market outcomes for representing an individual firm. All right, so what kind of tools could we use to measure the economy, to kind of think of the health of the economy? Well, there are lots of things that you might think of. Home sales or maybe housing prices. What is the unemployment rate? Should it be zero? How is the stock market performing? Maybe we look at earnings from major companies. All of these might be reasonable approaches. We'll see that some of this data becomes relevant, but there are a handful of measures that we look very closely at and that have kind of become essential benchmarks in measuring the health of the economy. Those are economic growth, which is a change in GDP. We'll look at the unemployment rate, which is the percentage of people who are unemployed, and we'll have a careful definition for that soon enough. And then inflation, a measure that is telling us about how quickly prices in the overall economy are rising. In terms of what we're going to cover in this chapter, we're going to talk about measuring the size of the economy, adjusting nominal to real, and we'll understand what that means, but basically the idea here is we're controlling for inflation. We'll look at how we might measure GDP over time, right, and compare our own economy with itself over time, how we might compare the United States with other countries, and we'll talk a little bit about GDP as a measure of well-being. All right, let's go back to those kind of key indicators. First of all, we are generally, if we think about the health of the economy, we are generally interested in, is the economy growing? Are we producing more over time? Economic growth then is closely related to a number of measures about well-being in society and quality of life. Right? We might use this definition here, GDP, percentage change in GDP, particularly again that real GDP, as a measure of economic growth. We'll also see that that might not be quite enough. We might want to look at GDP per capita, per person, as a change, as an important measure of the standard of living in a country. We'll also look at unemployment as a particularly important benchmark for the health of the economy. We can understand that if people are out of work, first of all, they're not doing productive things in the economy, but they also don't have income to go spend on other people doing productive things in the economy. Never mind the individual hardships that come with, right? On being unable to make your rent or send your kids to college or even keep food on the table, right? So clearly unemployment is an undesirable thing in terms of the quality of life of our citizens, but also just the overall functioning of the economy. We'll also look at inflation. Inflation is a sustained increase in the overall level of prices and is measured by the consumer price index. Okay, so we'll have a way of thinking about this consumer price index, but the basic idea here is that prices go up slowly over time, or in some cases rapidly over time, and we are not focused on an individual goods price. Instead, we are focused on the overall level of prices, and that's where this price index comes in. We don't want to be looking at the price of an individual good as a measure of inflation. All right, in terms of how we'll do this, like I said before, in micro, we had a lot of models. Every chapter we introduced a new model, we introduced new ways of thinking about evaluating or analyzing some environment, some context, a labor market, a competitive market for a good or service, or a less than competitive market. In macro, there are only a handful of really essential models that we need to look at, and in this class we're going to focus on one in particular, the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. This tool, this framework, will allow us to think about fluctuations in the economy. Maybe it's, again, significant or insufficient economic growth. Maybe it's high or low unemployment, and we'll see that zero unemployment is not the goal. Or maybe it's, again, high or low inflation, and we'll see that zero inflation is not the goal. It's this model that will allow us to think about changes in the economy that would be reflected in these things that we can observe about the economy. We'll also talk about some very important policy tools. You heard me mention that at the very beginning of this. We'll talk about fiscal policy, government spending used to manipulate the health of the economy, and monetary policy, which involves changing interest rates through the changes in the money supply. Whenever you hear, just yesterday, in fact, on October 30th, you heard that the Fed met and lowered interest rates. We're going to talk about that. That's monetary policy as a way of influencing the health of the economy. So those are ideas that are coming down the road, but it's probably useful to be aware of. So let's think about this thing, holding up a yardstick to the economy, thinking about how big the economy is. How would you go about doing that? Interesting piece here is that of all the things in economics, this is the thing that people have been doing the longest. So long as there has been a king or a queen or other who wanted to receive tax dollars, they have been sending people out riding around the countryside trying to measure the productive stuff that's going on in their economy in order to tax that behavior. So some of the earliest efforts to measure the output in a country that we have on record are directly tied to taxation. Again, the focus then wasn't necessarily on economic health, but it's still an effort to measure the size of the economy. As I mentioned before, macro tends to be very data first, and so I wanted to share with you early on in this section of the course a couple of websites that are important places to find information. You might use this information for your country analysis project, you might need to use this information for upcoming homework assignments, or you just might find it an interesting place to go and find out some things about the economy. You can also, of course, use these sources in other classes. I will be pushing these slides out on Moodle, so you'll have access to these. You'll also find many of these sites listed on the guiding document for our country analysis project, so you have access to these links directly. One that you'll find that I use a lot is this St. Louis Fed website. They have a Fred data tool here that's really good. This is the Federal Reserve for Education, and they do a really great job here at the St. Louis Fed of providing tools that professors and teachers and students can find particularly useful for different things. So again, we'll be visiting these websites on a regular basis. This is the St. Louis Federal Reserve website. You might want to think about that for your quiz. All right, thinking about, again, this effort to measure the economy, to think about how big the economy is. We generally introduce a measure here known as gross domestic product. This is the value of all final goods and services, this is language we'll want to focus on, produced within a country in a given year. I want to dissect a few of those pieces first. before we chug along too much. There are a couple of things that really matter here that are not always obvious to students. So when we say produced within a country, we mean that we are very literally going to count productive activity that happens within the borders of the United States. That means that we're going to count Toyotas produced in Ohio, and we're not going to count Fords produced in Mexico. What matters to us is the productive activity takes place in our country. Another piece here you'll see, this is value. As a result, we're going to have a dollar measure here. At the end of the day, GDP is a dollar measure. Okay, what else? This other thing here, produced within a country in a given year, we might look at quarterly, but within some time period, and it's produced within, that is the key language here. You see, if we, particularly around this time of the year, I really like candy corn pumpkins. It's one of my favorite candies. All right. I hate to say it, but if you're getting a candy corn pumpkin in September, that's probably not 2019 output. That's probably last year's output, right? And they've kept it in a warehouse somewhere, and now that the season's come around, they're ready to start selling it again. Okay, if that's the case, then the candy corn pumpkins that I just shamefully finished a little while ago are counted in last year's GDP, not this year's GDP. It's not that I bought them and consumed them in 2019 that matters. It's that they were produced in 2018 that matters. So that produced within a time period, that language is very specific. Another thing we're going to have to take on is this question about final goods and services. And we'll talk about that in just a slide or two here, where we'll see that this final is a really important distinction. We'll return to that soon enough. All right, so adding up GDP really just literally means coming up with the dollar amount that represents the value, the dollar value of all the stuff produced in that year. And we're talking about a very significant number of goods and services. But at the end of the day, what are we talking about? We take the quantity, the number of pizzas I made, multiply it by the price of that pizza, and then take the sum of all of those across all of the goods out there in the economy, and there's our GDP. I thought it might be worthwhile to take a look at some of this data. So here I've got the Federal Reserve Bank's website. Again, this is the St. Louis Federal Reserve. And I've used their graphing tool, again, a very powerful graphing tool, very click-based, very easy to use. You'll notice that it's showing me economic data going back from 1947 all the way up to the most recent data collected for this is in July of 2019. So I've got a very long panel of data here. So this is gross domestic product. You'll notice I've also got here real gross domestic product. I mentioned that a few slides ago. It has to do with adjusting for inflation. Okay, so what can we see here? So first of all, one thing we can see here is that our green line, gross domestic product, is increasing more rapidly than our blue line. We can see that there is an important moment at which these two intersect, all right? And then we can see that before that time period, real gross domestic product is above current or nominal gross domestic product, and then we see that it flips thereafter. This has to do with our ability to control for inflation, a topic we'll return to soon enough. These gray bars reflect recessions. So as we look at GDP fluctuating over time, we can see that there are some key moments in which GDP decreases instead of increases. I'm going to grab this little tool down here and I'm going to narrow my window. I'm looking here now at GDP adjusted for inflation and not adjusted for inflation from what looks like 2003 all the way up to the current period. And what you can see here is that starting in late 2007, early 2008, and even all the way through 2009, we have a recession, a decrease in output. And it looks pretty modest, I think, here on this graph. But I think that I don't need to tell you how severe the Great Recession was. The other recession that students are sometimes familiar with is this recession that precedes but includes 9/11. So we had some things going on even before 9/11, but then that depressed economic activity as well. And as a result, we have this recessionary period here in which output is not increasing. We're going to have to take on some of these questions. How would this happen? I'm going to narrow my window here a little bit to focus on the Great Recession. Okay, moves too far. Let's grab it and slide. All right. you can see that this is pretty severe economic downturn here. GDP is steadily marching up. We have over $15 trillion in real GDP in this period. By the time we get through the recession and things are starting to recover, right, real GDP in that period is 15.1 trillion compared to the 15.6 trillion or even 15.7 trillion from before the recession. So over this time period, a significant amount of time, we actually produced less. I think this is probably a good place to talk a little bit about what GDP measures and how we should think about GDP. Very often at this stage in the class, students start to think about macroeconomics, but maybe economics in general, as being about stuff. And I think it's really important that we step outside of that box, because the reality is that, yeah, we're measuring the dollar amount of the output produced in a country, sure, but that output includes things like food, clothing, shelter, healthcare, education. It includes things that are really important to how we live, our quality of life. Economics is not about consumerism. We do measure output, we do measure stuff, but that stuff is produced in a way that generally improves people's lives, and that people are paid to produce, and then they can go out and achieve their own goals, right? Maybe I love my job and what I do, but maybe I just view my job as a means to an end that allows me to raise a family or travel, right? So the value of what we produce in the economy is an important benchmark. It is not a measure of frivolous output, but instead an important way of thinking about the overall health of the economy and therefore the quality of life for citizens in our economy. Okay, so a couple of interesting ideas in here about the recession. Let's go slide our window all the way to current period. Again, this is 2019. And in fact, you can see quarter 3 there, 2019 data. You can see that real GDP, adjusted for inflation, was on the order of $19 trillion. $19 trillion. That's a very large economy. We produce a lot of stuff in the United States. You can see that gross domestic product, what we'll call nominal GDP, using current prices, is $21.5 trillion, much, much higher. The fact that prices have gone up over time, the role of inflation in here is really important, and you can see that by this gap between real GDP and nominal or unadjusted GDP. Okay, so just a quick glance at what GDP is and give you an idea of what it'll look like to control for price level change. All right, so what goes into GDP? Well, one way of measuring GDP is to ask what kind of spending occurred on goods produced this year. And we can think about GDP then as being made up of 4 parts. In one case, we have consumer spending. This is spending by households, the largest component of GDP in most years, up to 2/3 of GDP in most years, but the largest in every year. And that tells us that consumer confidence and consumer spending is really a really important part of the economy. Then we have an interesting category here, investment spending. This investment spending includes what you might think of for firms buying capital equipment, but it also includes some other things that are not always so clear. It's in here that we're going to pick up inventory changes. So going back to my candy corn pumpkins, we were able to account for those candy corn pumpkins in 2018 by seeing that the company's inventory increased by 1 unit, which was worth such and such dollars. This year, when we look at my spending and consumption expenditures, we have that spending picked up. And so we're going to have to account for that or adjust for that by seeing, well, hey, their inventory decreased by this amount in that year. So there are some adjustments that need to be made. This also includes purchases of new construction, new buildings, which would also include residential housing. That's sometimes a surprise to students. Residential housing actually goes in this category. One important note here, this is not investment like you might think of in another class, right? Investment here in econ does not mean buying stocks and bonds and building a portfolio for returns, financial assets. Instead, here investment means generally the purchase of capital equipment, but we've talked about some other things, inventory changes and new construction, whether that's residential or commercial, that show up in here as well. All right, we've got consumption, investment. Of course, then we have another important player in the economy, government expenditure. The government is a significant player in our economy, amounting for at least 20% of the output in a given year. And this includes all levels of government, federal, state, and local. We can think about government as government spending as having a couple of parts here. They spend on things they consume, right? We talk about pushing around paper, right? Well, at the DMV, they had to buy all that paper, and that paper is consumed as they go about their business. But we can also think about the government investing, building hospitals, building schools, building roads. And so they have kind of two broad categories of government spending that we think about. We do not think about here transfer payments, which is to say payments that go from one member of society to another. We'll pick up that income when the people who receive it spend it. All right, another really important piece here. Let's talk about net exports. Net exports is the dollar value of our exports minus the dollar value of our imports. This structure here, exports minus imports, then is really important. The United States is generally a net importer, which is to say we import more than we export. So this value for our economy is often a large negative number. If we look, I grabbed this example out of your text. If we looked at how we come up with GDP, then GDP is the sum of consumption spending, investment spending, government spending, and net exports. Here's an interesting slide from your text in which they talk about trillions of dollars in GDP in 2014. And they're able to add each of these terms up. You can see the percents of the total there. And you can see that exports add to GDP, our imports reduce GDP. And you can see that because this number is larger than this number, our net exports is pulling down on GDP. Thinking about these in terms of shares, we can see again how important consumption is. We can see net exports in here, government spending and investment spending in here as well. I thought it might be interesting to look at some of this in our with the help of our graphing tools from. So here I am again at the St. Louis Fed website. You can see I've got our GDP unadjusted for inflation and then its components in here. Thought we might look at GDP and its components in a particular period here, maybe trying to look at our most recent data. So what we can see here in the quarters of 2019, we can see again our gross domestic product unadjusted on the order of $21 trillion. You can see that net exports is a significant negative number, $633 billion, a negative number pulling down on GDP, signaling that we import much more than we export. We see government expenditure in there, a significant portion here, investment a significant portion, each on the order of $3+ trillion. But it's really that personal consumption, household spending, the $14 trillion that forms the base of our GDP measure. So in this graph, you can see how each of these components here has changed over time. You can see that we can track each of these pieces through the recession, and we'll find that some components of GDP are impacted more than others. Right? We see that personal consumption decreases here from $10 trillion to $9.9 trillion. All right, we can see that private investment goes from 2.5 trillion to 1.8, a much larger percentage change in GDP. So that investment gets hit really hard. All right. And you can see these different components of our spending being impacted by the recession. Similarly, I've pulled up here on the BEA website, Bureau of Economic Analysis website. You can see the front page here. They have a lot of important tools you might use. They release regular reports. And I've pulled up here the news release for the second quarter of 2019. And it's got GDP in that quarter and then some other important pieces you might be interested in. They do their own production of materials here, so I can actually click on that and save it if I want to use it in a report, or cite those things appropriately. This is the kind of brief contents of it here, but there is definitely a much denser version, a full report here. So this is kind of the one pager they've set out. All right. And they're noting here that we have quarter three data here. Let's look at some of the full release information here. Here we have a 20-page document. Includes what's in that summary, includes some key things they point to that have changed, and then there are down here definitions of terms, and then a whole significant array of tables on this kind of information. But it might be worthwhile to look at some of these things in the economy and make some observations. So here we are, this is Q2 data in 2019, and we see a large and significant decrease in the building of structures. So that is non-residential structures, new construction in the commercial sector in our gross private domestic investment component. That investment is an important piece of the economy because it tells us about what we'll likely be able to use to produce next year, right? If we're building new factories, we'll be more productive in the future. But there is a lot more information than that here. I just wanted to grab an example and give you an idea of the kinds of things that are in here. All right, let's talk a little bit about a couple of things that we need to be careful about. So when we look at consumption, we are going to think about consumption falling into a couple of different categories. We'll see that we think about spending on durable goods, non-durable goods, and services. And that durable goods component is really sensitive to fluctuations in the economy as well. It's easy to put off buying a new car or a new refrigerator compared to non-durable items like food and clothing. Those are things we tend to see as necessities. Services is, of course, a really important component of consumer spending. All right, and then we've talked a little bit already about structures, and then we talked about changes in inventory when we talked about measuring GDP at a given point in time. So just image grabbed from your text that talks about the relative share of these things. You can see that services is a significant component of our spending in the economy. Let's return to a point from earlier on about how in GDP we want to measure final goods. Final goods are to be contrasted with intermediate goods. Intermediate goods are goods that need some further processing or will be resold and are kind of in process to becoming a final good. A good example of this might be the tires on a brand new car, or the ingredients in a meal, or your toppings on your pizza. So the question is how will we count those things? You see, if we count the value of the new tires and we count the value of the automobile, well, it's certainly not the case that the company is giving you those tires for free. Right? The cost of those tires is showing up in the price of the automobile. So if we count the tires initially, and then we look at the price of the car, we've effectively double counted those tires. Once when we counted them individually, and then once when they were wrapped into the value of the car. Another example here, the ingredients in your stir fry. Certainly, you're not getting those ingredients for free, right? You go to a restaurant, you get your meal, you know that the price of that meal includes the cost of the ingredients, the workers' time. These kinds of things are an important part of understanding where prices even come from. Go back to our micro section of the course. Right? So if we want to account for the value of these vegetables, we will pick them up when we look at the price of the stir-fry dinner you got. We don't need to count them initially as individual items themselves. So we count final goods, not intermediate goods, because the intermediate goods will show up in the price of our final goods. So when we look at GDP, we've already talked about this piece here, current production. Let's make it very explicit. There are some things that are not included in GDP that we want to be very careful about. So we've already said intermediate goods. We've talked a little bit about the fact that it must be current production, so that probably makes clear that secondhand sales do not count. And this is something to think carefully about. This means that your car, when you bought it, was not counted in GDP unless it was a brand new car. Right? A car or a house and many other items might be bought and sold many times in the life of those goods. But they are only ever counted in GDP in the year in which they were produced. We've already mentioned that we don't count financial transactions. And then an important piece here, any illegal good or service is not going to show up in GDP. Right? So any underground production, any economic activity that happens outside of the legal markets that we so carefully observe. We're not measuring them in the first place, but also even if we could, they wouldn't get counted in GDP. This brings up an interesting question, right, about how we compare two countries. Right? For example, in Illinois, we know that marijuana is going to be legal in January. All of a sudden, a good for which there is, of course, a market today, we don't count that market today, the value of that output today, but starting in January, we will. Right? It becomes an interesting question about how we compare a country with itself over time or compare two countries when there might be differences in how they define what is legal and what is not. One of the important topics in this chapter involves adjusting nominal GDP, something measured in current prices, to real GDP, something measured in again, it's still a dollar measure, but measured in a way that controls for price level change over time. So we're going to work on this distinction between nominal GDP using current prices and real GDP adjusted for inflator. We're going to talk about how we calculate it, and then we'll do a couple of examples. Again, the basic idea here is that over time, prices increase. This idea of inflation, this language of inflation is particularly accurate because if we look at GDP and we want to think about what it represents, the value that's represented in that GDP is being inflated by price level increase over time. We want to control for that. We want to look at real value, what we've actually produced and how valuable it is in our society. So we've got to make an adjustment for that price level change. One more time, nominal here means measured in current prices or the prices that actually exist at the time. So if we look at output in 1955 and we're looking at nominal GDP, we're going to use 1955 prices to evaluate the value of any of those goods and services. Okay, but if prices go up over time, then when we look back at the 50s, we're going to see that we're going to view GDP as arbitrarily less than it actually is, just because prices were lower then, if we want to compare it with today. So what we want to do is control for that. We're looking at real GDP. We're going to come up with a way to adjust for price level change over time. To do this, we're going to develop the GDP price index, sometimes referred to as the GDP deflator. This is a price index that measures the average of prices of all the goods and services included in our measure of the economy. So we build a metric, we build a tool for measuring price level change. We'll look at price indices in a little bit more detail later on, especially when we talk about inflation. That consumer price index we talked about before will end up being really important in there. All right, if we thought about value, right, we could think about value as price times quantity. Right? We talked about that when we talked about GDP. All right, well, our next step then is to adjust that value. What prices do we use? In a very literal way, we might say, well, I'm going to use the prices today or in some other time period, some reference period or base period to evaluate quantities at other time periods. That's really what's going on here. So we'll build an index that we will use to adjust prices to look at production at different time periods. All right, well, if we wanted to think a little bit about how we could get to real GDP, we're going to take our nominal GDP, the dollar amount of output produced in a year at that year's prices, and we're going to divide it by our GDP price index. Something to be careful about, the index is published with a base of 100, and so when we do these calculations, we want to make sure that in this denominator we don't cost ourselves a couple of decimal points. And so we're going to divide by 100, divide our price index by 100. All right, so as we continue to move along with our discussion of GDP, we've just been talking about adjusting nominal GDP to get to real GDP. As we think about growth then, we're going to want to look at changes in real GDP, not changes in nominal GDP. So here's a pretty extreme example, but if we wanted to look at how the economy has grown from 1960 to 2010, we would do our new minus old, our current minus the original over the original price, a much simpler percentage change calculation than we did with our elasticities, for example. And then we'll multiply by 100 to get a nice round number out, and that will get us our percent change. So here is GDP in 2010, 13.5, and this is real GDP, $1 trillion, nearly 13.6. minus the $2.8 trillion in 1960. Put that over the 2.8, multiply by 100, and you get a 376% increase in output over that time period. Pretty substantial growth in the economy. Of course, that's over a 50-year period. All right, as we move along here and we think about recessions and expansions and changes in the health of the economy, we want to start thinking about these numbers in terms of what they mean for the life of people living in that economy. Again, economics is a social science. All right, let's talk about some of these pieces. A decline in output, particularly a decrease in real GDP that lasts longer than 2 quarters or lasts 6 months or more, is referred to as a recession. That piece is important. Lasts 6 months or more. That's what we call a recession. In the past, we've had a depression, a great recession that was so deep and so lengthy that we refer to it as a depression. There isn't really a particular tipping point before we call something a depression because we only have the one on record. All right. So this big drop in GDP that occurred during the Great Depression was very significant and very persistent, associated with a lot of hardship in the United States and in many other countries as well. The Great Recession, also a very painful time, and you've all lived through that. And just to give you an idea of the difference in scale here, the unemployment rate, again, a measure we talk about when we talk about the health of the economy, for people in the United States during the Great Recession was as high as 10%. 1 in 10 people who wanted work couldn't find work. In the Great Depression, the unemployment rate was as high as 25%. 1 in 4 people who wanted work couldn't find work. So you can see how the Great Depression is just significantly more severe than what we had in the Great Recession. All right, some tables here showing you some of these kinds of things. Here is the Great Recession. Here is the Great Depression. You can see how the economy kind of alternates over time. This idea is known as the business cycle, the fluctuation of economic activity. We can see peaks and troughs, highest points in the neighborhood and lowest points in the neighborhood. This kind of fluctuation is known as the business cycle, moving from a high point to a low point, these kinds of things. Some interesting tables here from your text that show you about recessions and economic fluctuations. And so some of the important time periods that we can see here as we think about the recessions. Here is a recession that we can see being pretty severe here in the late 1920s. All right, 23 months of contraction. That's nearly 2 years straight. All right, and then we can see, so even over this panel, there are many recessions that are particularly long, right? 23 months, 24 months. Economic fluctuations then are pretty severe and pretty persistent. If we look here, 1933 to 1937, here's where some real economic hardship comes in as well. 43 months straight of economic decline. That's pretty severe. If you look, though, over the period in between then and the Great Recession, recessions become less frequent, so there are more periods of expansion, and they become less long-lived. We have shorter recessionary periods. This period is often referred to as the Great Moderation. Everything is great when you talk about these kind of economic fluctuations. A long period of time in which recessions are relatively modest, particularly compared to the long-lived recessions in the preceding period. We come out of World War II and the economy is a little bit smoothed out. The thought in this time period was that we've really figured out how to manage the economy. And another important question, how much to manage the economy? Do we really want to manage the economy so intensively? And so we felt like we really had a hold on things. And then came along the Great Recession. This is a particularly severe recession. You'll notice that it isn't much longer than any of the other recessions in this time period, 18 months, but we had a 16-month one in the late 1970s. But you see here that we have significant periods of recession during this 1930s period, 43 months. Right? That's a really severe recession, really long-lasting. And the Great Recession is not nearly so long. But still, we account it as we think of it as a particularly poignant part of our history in the United States. All right, one of the important pieces about comparing GDP, and particularly talking about economic growth, is comparing GDP or thinking about GDP in the context of population. It's one thing to say that an economy is of a certain size and be talking about the level of output. It's another thing entirely to be talking about the economy in the context of population. See, I might have a lot of output, but not have nearly a sufficient level of output to actually account for or think of how much output my citizens actually have access to. So we probably want to do better than just talking about GDP. We probably want to talk about GDP per capita, output per person. This is probably a better measure than of the size of an economy or of people's access to resources. To give you an example of this kind of thing, compare two economies. In 2015, there was an economy that had an output level of $17 trillion. There was another economy that had an output level of $241 billion. Which of these countries would you rather live in? Right? Well, if I think about the size of the economy, $17 trillion in output is a lot more than $241 billion in output. But we better ask about the population. That first country with the $17 trillion in output is China. The population at the time was 1.3 billion, giving us a per capita GDP right around $3,800. The other country, Denmark, with the economy of $241 billion, the economic output of $241 billion, had a population of just 5.6 million with an M. The GDP per capita then is around $47,500. A significant difference between these two economies. And that becomes an important part then of thinking about quality of life in a country, GDP per capita. So when we look at growth, we move on into chapter 20 later on, we're going to look at GDP per capita quite a bit as an important way of thinking about quality of life. Many of the ideas in macroeconomics really have to do with this question about public health, quality of life, standard of living. And we need to be careful in here because it's not enough to say a country with more output definitely has a better quality of life. Even GDP per capita is a statement about, on average, the access to resources a citizen has. But it doesn't mean anything about the access to resources a person really has. And so when we think about standard of living, we've really got to be a little bit more careful. GDP per capita is associated with some really important changes in quality of life. Countries that see their GDP per capita go up generally see the literacy rates go up, the infant mortality and maternal mortality rates go down, generally see better health outcomes, education outcomes, and as a result, we even see political and social stability over time as well. So there's a lot that is associated with GDP, but we don't want to associate causality with it. That is to say, more output will cause better outcomes. They tend to be correlated, but that isn't the same thing as saying that these things are causally related, that more output causes better outcomes. So we need to be a little bit careful when we talk about the standard of living. A couple of examples I like to use when thinking about whether or not GDP measures the standard of living involve things like leisure time. And we'll kind of pick up in class with this conversation. But you can imagine two countries that have the same level of output, but one country produces that output working 12-hour days, 6 days a week on average. And the other economy produces that output using, let's say, 8 hours a day, 4 days a week. I know which country I'd rather live in. But if we just looked at GDP, they might both produce the same dollar amount of output, and we'll have missed something important in there. So we're going to come back to this question. And even when we come back to class, we're going to revisit a couple of the ideas covered in this lecture. But I wanted to get this far because when we talk about macro ideas like economic growth, we really are talking about something fundamental about quality of life, standard of living, what it's like to live in that society. It's for that reason that I like to direct students, and I'm going to ask you to do this as well. So again, you'll get these slides posted on Moodle, and this website, this Gapminder website, is going to be linked in this final slide. I'll add one after here that has that Gapminder quiz. So let's be careful. There are two things that remain today. This video is nearly complete. After you close out this video, you will go to the Moodle page. You will find a very short quiz there that makes reference to, asks you about things from this video. Again, that, as I mentioned in class, that if you were paying attention to this video and taking notes as you might normally in class, you should be able to answer pretty easily. Also, and so you'll need to answer that quiz immediately after this video is finished. The quiz is timed to end about 15 minutes after our class time. So there is a little bit of time in there if you don't have a class immediately after ours, but you're going to want to head over there and take that quiz right away. But before we come back on Monday, I would like you to take this quiz. This is the Gapminder test. It is tied to the authors of a really interesting book on public health. I can probably pull this up really quickly here. Factfulness by Hans Rosling here. It's actually written with his daughter and wife, and is a really neat book about public health and just generally about how we don't fully understand quality of life around the planet, and we have some misconceptions in here. So I really recommend this book. I've recommended only a handful of books throughout the class. It's a really great book about how we understand the world and often how significantly wrong we are. The topics this book is about specifically relate to public health, and as a result, and kind of global public health. As a result, it's kind of a good way of getting started with this conversation about macroeconomics. So this you don't have to do immediately after we get done here, though you might. But you might, but before Monday, I would like you to go to this website and take this quiz. There are only 13 questions. They are about public health issues. And have, again, these things are tied to the quality of life of citizens in a country. We have a simple time limit of 45 seconds per question. You shouldn't need more than that. So this whole quiz won't take you very long at all. And I just want you to come in on Monday, and we're going to talk a little bit about this quiz and talk a little bit about people's results, and just see, how well do we understand the world as it really is. So one more time, after this video, go to the Moodle page and complete the quiz that is there, a handful of questions about this video. Sometime before Monday, when we come back to class, I would like you to take this Gapminder test, a quick quiz, shouldn't take you very long at all, and just keep in mind your results and some of the questions as we come into class on Monday. When we get back on Monday, then we're going to pick up with content from where we left off. So we'll have a couple of topics I'll talk about in review related to some of the ideas we've covered today. We'll do a sample problem, but we'll pick up with this conversation about quality of life pretty early on, and then be done with Chapter 19, be moving into economic growth, and so you'll want to set an appropriate pace in your reading. I appreciate you spending the time watching this video. I know this is not a typical format for us. These slides will be available on Moodle, and so you should be able to follow along in there as well. So come on back to class on Monday, ready to go with content in Chapter 19. Have a great weekend. I will see you all then.